as we've gotten closer and closer to the start of the season, I've just started to convince myself, like, you know what? John Calipari, I know he hasn't made a Final Four since 2015. He hasn't won a national championship in a decade now. But at the end of the day, this Kentucky team is going to be right in the thick of things when it matters the most. They do have the number one recruiting class with all those guys: DJ Wagner, Robert Dillingham, Justin Edwards, Aaron Bradshaw. They obviously have those guys I just mentioned, older players coming back. And I do like the mix in age and experience within this team. And even though it might not look like some of the Kentucky teams that we've seen in the last few years, maybe that's a good thing for John Calipari to be going back to these freshman-oriented teams, because he's had a lot of success winning with them.
Yeah, one quick thing, by the way, I'm not here to correct you, but I don't want BBN on your, behind is Florentor in Toronto. Like I think you said Spain there.
I said Spain, my bad.
Yeah, I mean they're basically the same thing, very contemporary cities. Anyway, so Kentucky. So first of all, you mentioned this, and you talk about things you get right, you get wrong. Like I think I was probably very critical and maybe too critical of Kentucky in the offseason. During the portal cycle, right? You see a program like Arkansas reaching out to everybody, St. John's, who we talked about last episode, reaching out to everybody. And I thought Cal was moving a little bit too slow. And I don't think there was I guess there was a master plan, but I thought he was moving too slow. But I think really what it came down to was he knew how good his freshmen were. Aaron Bradshaw's hurt right now, but at the time we didn't think he was hurt. Maybe Cal knew, because I think he hurt his foot in June, whatever. So the point I'm trying to make is I think he knew, I brought on all these guys to play. Like, I'm not bringing in somebody to play over Justin Edwards, over DJ Wagner, over Aaron Bradshaw. And so again, I was probably a little too critical of Kentucky in the portal cycle. And I agree is that, listen, I know it's easy to say, oh, it's an overseas trip, it's a foreign trip, it's a whatever, blah, 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 this and that. You can't take too much out of it. Two things stand out. One, I do think it was different than the typical foreign tour, because this was an event where Kentucky was basically the Team USA representative in an international tournament. And so why I bring it up is a foreign tour traditionally is not, hey, we have to win at all costs. I remember looking up some stuff on Kansas State, and Jerome Tang made it a priority. We're going to play a different starting lineup in every game on our tour because we want to see different that. Kentucky was there to win that tournament, and to their credit, they were great. And so to your point, I think I was probably a little lower on them too, but I also think seeing them in person, you can see the talent. You could see the fact that, that why all these guys were so highly rated. And the other thing I'll say, and I think you and I probably chatted about this at some point in the summer, you love Oscar Tshiebwe, you love what he meant to that program. But when you see that team without Oscar Tshiebwe, you can see some of the limitations that they had with him. And I love the kid, and he was great for college basketball. But when he was on the court, you kind of had to center, no pun intended, but center everything around him. Whereas the first possession of those games in Toronto, you see them up and down the court, pressing, dribble drive, beat your guy off the dribble, kick it out into the corner. Those are just things you couldn't do without Oscar Tshiebwe. And so I don't mean to belabor the point. He was a great player, national player of the year, but I don't think I realized how limited you can be when he is in your lineup until I actually saw Kentucky without him. And it sounds weird, you lose a national player of the year type player, a guy that did win it 2 years ago, and you think how are you going to replace him? I think in some ways, in many ways, this team will be better, deeper, kind of all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, because with Tshiebwe, even though he was a star and he was super productive, when he was on the floor, that Kentucky just had a clear weakness. The opponent could just put him in a ball screen, and there's that. He wasn't able to defend it. And I know a lot of Kentucky fans were really interested in Hunter Dickinson this offseason too. He ended up going to Kansas, but I'm curious to see, you have Bradshaw, you have Edwards, you have all of these guys. I know there's been some talk about those guys and playing center, would you want to put him there? But you have Trey Mitchell too. And I'm looking forward to seeing Kentucky, I don't want to say play a more modern style of offense, because there's no evidence that they're going to do that, but I definitely think it would be a little bit more pointed in that direction, because we know this team at times last year, including in that NCAA tournament loss to Kansas State, it would just be so hard for them to score the ball at times. And I'm just hoping with quicker, more athletic guys like Wagner, and Dillingham with the ball in their hands too, like that will be able to help things. And they have experience. Like I can't emphasize that enough, how important adding Reeves and Mitchell were, especially as late in the offseason as they were able to do it.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned we don't have evidence, and I think that's the big thing with Kentucky is when those guys do get healthy, are you going to stick with the way that you played in Toronto? Because it was clearly effective. One other thing two other things. One, I do think the kid they just got on campus, Zvonimir Ivisic, he just did a little interview with Coach Cal right before we recorded here. I saw, big kid, Croatian. I think he's going to be really important to them, especially early in the season. He's skinny, but he's kind of a stretch player, whatever. And so I think he's an important guy to mention with them. The other thing I do want to say, you talked about Kansas State and this and that. Like, I'm not making excuses because whenever you preface stuff like this, it sounds like you're making excuses. But remember, they were up at like the under 4-minute mark. I think they were up against Kansas State. And then Keontae Johnson went crazy, hit some really, really, really tough shots. And it is worth noting, like that was obviously the game that unfortunately Antonio Reeves, who had been great for them, had 40 points or 38 points or whatever it was in Fayetteville, just couldn't hit a bucket. And doesn't mean he's a bad kid, doesn't mean anything like that. But it's like there were so many like if that kid goes, and I think I did the math on this, I forget what it was. I think he ended up shooting like 2 of 19 from the field or something like that. And I remember looking it up and being like, okay, he shot like 8% from the field. And if he shot like 20% from the field instead of 8%, they beat Kansas State, and then they're going to the Sweet 16 at Madison Square Garden. So I'm not making excuses, but this was not like this wasn't a team last year that like got into the NCAA tournament like holding on for dear life. Like they got there, they played a really good team. I actually, listen, I picked Kansas State. I thought it was a bad matchup for them because of Oscar Tshiebwe. But they weren't that far off from going to the Sweet 16, would have matched up well with Michigan State, et cetera. It's not an excuse. It's a whatever. It's a reality. And I just bring it up, say, I think they're one of the more intriguing teams in the SEC this year because I think they have a chance to be really good because, as you said, Cal, these are the teams that he thrives with. We talk about, Tennessee early in the year being really good. Kentucky, I think, is going to get better over the course of the year. Really excited to watch them.
I was going to ask you about that, the age factor, because we know in college basketball how important it is to have an older, experienced team, especially if you want to win in March. And like we mentioned earlier, there was one point in the offseason where it was looking like during the transfer portal when all of those guys like Hunter Dickinson were committing, it's like, man, does John Calipari like know what's going on in college basketball? How is he bringing in just a team full of freshmen and think that's going to be able to be successful in March? But he got two of those guys, two older experienced players within the program. How do you feel about that in 2023, 2024, having a freshman latent team? If anyone could have success with it, it is John Calipari, based on the fact that he did it so many times earlier in his coaching tenure in Lexington. But do you think that philosophy and having such a young group of players leading the team could be successful in today's version of the game?
So I'm so glad you asked, and we did not prepare this question and answer but before the show, but I think I get it. And as somebody who loves the portal and follows it as closely as anybody, I get that it's an older sport, right? But at the end of the day, first of all, the narrative that you can't win in college basketball with freshmen is nonsense. Alabama last year was the #1 team in the country for most of the year. I think it was three of their top five scorers were freshmen. It was Brandon Miller, Jaden Bradley, and Noah Clowney was the other one. Like, they were awesome all year long. And they had two guys that were McDonald's All-Americans in Miller and Bradley. And then Clowney was, I think, a first-round pick, maybe early second. I can't remember where he ended up. But, I mean, they were all freshmen, and they were awesome because the freshmen were good enough. And I think you could see something similar at Kentucky. Now, #1 team in the country for most of the year, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think that they can overachieve because I think the freshmen are good enough. And I think, he played against older kids in that international tournament. I know people say, oh, it's some tournament. Who cares? It's like, no, but I don't think they'll be intimidated. And the other thing is, I think it's worth noting, virtually everybody else in college basketball, they're going to be going through growing pains too, right? Now you play Kansas early. Kansas is really good. But you look at Alabama. Alabama lost a ton of talent. I think Alabama's going to be good. We'll talk about them. But they lost a lot. Arkansas obviously lost a lot. you go on and on down the list. I'm trying to think of some of the teams that Kentucky plays in the out of conference outside of them. It's like everybody lost stuff. And I think having those extra games on that trip to Toronto helped. And like, I'm just not as down on them as everybody else. I think everybody else wants to, the Calipari era is dead. He can't win in the tournament anymore. Like, I don't buy it. I mean, and I'm not, again, it sounds like when you say stuff like this, you're making an excuse, right? But St. Peter's is obviously inexcusable, but like you go on, and by the way, St. Peter's, they were up by like double figures in the second half in that game and melted down. Kansas State, they were in the lead with Antonio Reeves literally doing nothing with under 5 minutes to go. So they're not that far away from having another couple runs, but we just said it with Rick Barnes. It is a tournament-based sport. It is a March-based sport. It's when everybody pays attention. And, Kentucky more than anybody. And we talked about this on our Big East preview. And I said this as a UConn guy, is that Dan Hurley's first 2 NCAA tournaments, it was one and done. And there started to become a question of like, okay, can you win games in March? Now, he obviously quieted those critics, but UConn is a lot like Kentucky. Kentucky is a lot like UConn, whatever you want to say. The expectation isn't to get to the NCAA tournament and be happy with that. The expectation is to win games when you get there. Cal hasn't done it enough. And bluntly, he deserves the criticism that he's been getting the last couple of years.
Absolutely. Looking at Kentucky's non-conference schedule, they really just have 3 big marquee games. It's Kansas in the Champions Classic. It's Miami at home in the ACC SEC Challenge. And then they will host North Carolina in mid-December. I see the Louisville game on there. I don't really know if we should count that or not. But
well, they do play Gonzaga late. They play Gonzaga. Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. I'm glad they did this. And I don't know I honestly don't know if Kentucky didn't want to front load their schedule or whether Gonzaga is starting to buy that narrative of like, hey, we don't play enough big games late in the season. But I think that's going to be a really cool showcase for college basketball, is to get that Gonzaga game in February. It's probably either the weekend of the Super Bowl or the weekend before the Super Bowl, when people are really starting to pay attention to college basketball. So I'm not totally sure as to why they decided to schedule that game then, but I think that's going to be great. But by then we should kind of have a feel for who Kentucky is. And that's how Cal has always been. I think he's done a good job of, you get those 2 or 3 marquee out of conference games, Champions Classic, CBS Sports Classic, like you said, against North Carolina. He'll never play an MTE. That's not what he does. He doesn't believe in them. But you'll get those 2 or 3 marquee non-conference games. Then you get into SEC play. As you said, I guess Louisville by technicality maybe is a marquee game. But I'll tell you what, that'll be a separate podcast in and of itself if they lose to Louisville. Because, you think people are mad now. If they lose to this Louisville team, there would be a lot of, be a lot of unhappy people in blue. So